Lucas was just a quiet new kid, an easy target for bullies. They thought he was weak, an easy plaything, but they had no idea who they were messing with. What happens next will shock you. Stay until the end to find out the truth. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Lucas stepped out of the car, his worn-out backpack slung over one shoulder, his dark eyes lowered as his father gave him a short nod before driving away. This was his third school in 2 years, and he had learned not to get too comfortable. Being the new kid meant being an outsider. He felt the weight of judgmental stares as he walked through the front doors, students already sizing him up. His clothes were plain, unbranded, nothing flashy. His hair was cropped short, practical rather than stylish. Worst of all, he kept his head down, avoiding eye contact. The school hallways were alive with chatter, but as Lucas passed, the murmurs shifted. He knew what they were thinking. A new face, an unfamiliar presence. To some, it was just another student in a sea of faces. To others, it was a fresh target. By the time lunch rolled around, Lucas had already become an invisible shadow, finding an empty table in the farthest corner of the cafeteria. He kept his head low as he ate, trying to avoid drawing attention, but some people thrived on seeking out those who didn't fit in. "Yo, look at this guy." A loud voice cut through the noise. Lucas recognized it immediately as belonging to someone used to be in the center of attention. He didn't react, but he could sense them approaching. A tray slammed down onto the table, sending bits of food scattering. Lucas took a slow breath, not looking up. "What's up, new kid?" Another voice, mocking, expectant. Lucas recognized the dynamic instantly. He had seen it before, the need to establish dominance over someone perceived as weak. A heavy hand yanked away his tray, spilling what was left of his food onto the table. The cafeteria fell into an eerie hush, pockets of students turning to watch the inevitable. Lucas slowly picked up his drink, taking a measured sip before setting it back down. The leader of the group, a tall, broad-shouldered guy named Brian, smirked, satisfied. Lucas didn't fight back. That meant he was weak, and weak meant easy prey. Laughter of Brian's two friends, Max and Leo, echoed through the cafeteria. Lucas knew their type well. Brian was the ringleader, the instigator. Max was his enforcer, always ready to throw a punch but lacking his own direction. Leo was the follower, laughing at the right moments, supporting the acts but never leading them. Lucas didn't flinch, didn't give them the reaction they wanted, but he knew what was coming. Ignoring bullies never worked. It only made them try harder. The next day, as Lucas walked toward his locker, he felt the sudden impact from behind. His shoulder slammed against the cold metal, the sound echoing through the hallway. "Oh, didn't see you there," Brian sneered, laughing as Max and Leo joined in. Lucas adjusted his backpack and kept walking, showing no signs of acknowledgement. But that wasn't enough for them. During gym class, the coach divided students into teams for basketball. Lucas ended up on Brian's team, which was a mistake. Every time Lucas got the ball, someone shoved him, tripped him, or stole it before he could make a move. "You even know how to play?" Max taunted, snatching the ball away with ease. Lucas clenched his jaw but stayed silent. He wasn't here to impress anyone. He just had to make it through the day. But Brian wasn't done. As they walked toward the locker room, he stepped in front of Lucas, blocking his path. "You don't belong here," Brian said, his voice dripping with arrogance. Lucas met his gaze for the first time. His face was unreadable, void of emotion. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away. The laughter behind him was loud, triumphant. "Yeah, that's what I thought," Brian shouted after him. But he didn't know. None of them did. Lucas wasn't afraid. He was calculating. and soon everything would change. Lucas knew the cycle. It always started with casual taunts, small jabs meant to test the waters. If the target didn't react, the bullying would escalate, pushing boundaries until the victim either snapped or broke completely. Lucas refused to give them the reaction they craved, but he also knew that his silence was like blood in the water, attracting more aggression. Brian and his friends weren't just testing him anymore. They had made up their minds. Lucas was their new plaything, their new target, and they were going to push until he broke. The days that followed were filled with calculated torment. In the hallways, Lucas felt sudden, sharp shoves against his shoulder, slamming him into lockers. His books were knocked from his hands, and when he bent down to pick them up, a foot would suddenly kick them further down the corridor. Snickering laughter followed him wherever he went. In the cafeteria, his tray was often tipped just enough for food to spill, forcing him to walk back and get a new one while the three bullies laughed behind him. Even when he sat down to eat, they would casually flick crumbs or small bits of food onto his table, just enough to be noticed but never enough to be reported. The physical aggression was just as relentless. Brian, Max, and Leo made sure that gym class became a battlefield. Every time Lucas touched the ball, someone would body check him, steal the ball, or trip him. At first, it seemed random, but Lucas knew better. They were testing him, waiting for him to react. He refused. "Go on, man, do something," Max taunted after knocking the ball from Lucas's hands. Lucas dusted off his palms and continued playing, unfazed. Leo smirked. "Think he's scared?" "He's just a loser," Brian muttered, throwing an elbow into Lucas's ribs as they passed. The coach wasn't looking. Lucas clenched his jaw but didn't react. The day continued in the same pattern. In math class, someone accidentally knocked over his chair. In the hallway, someone tugged on his backpack, nearly making him stumble. The goal was clear, to break him down piece by piece. The more Lucas stayed silent, the worse it became. The next day, Lucas was walking toward his locker when he felt it again, a hard shove against his back. His shoulder hit the cold metal with a loud clang, drawing attention from students nearby. Brian was behind him, smirking. "Oops, didn't see you there," he said mockingly. Max and Leo laughed, standing on either side of Brian like bodyguards. Lucas calmly straightened his posture, adjusted his backpack, and kept walking. Brian clicked his tongue. "Still acting like you don't care? That's cute." Lucas knew it wasn't over. Later that day, in gym class, the coach assigned basketball teams. Lucas ended up on Brian's team again. This time, Brian had a plan. Each time Lucas received the ball, Brian or Max made sure to foul him, tripping him or pushing him just enough to make him lose control. The coach barely noticed. If Lucas tried to dribble, Leo would yank his arm just enough to throw him off balance. Finally, as Lucas tried to pass, Brian slammed into him with his shoulder, sending him sprawling to the ground. "Oh, my bad," Brian said, grinning. "Didn't see you there." Lucas stood up, dusted himself off, and kept playing. He could feel the eyes of the students around him, watching, waiting for a reaction. He gave them none. After class, in the locker room, Brian and his friends cornered him. "You don't belong here," Brian said, stepping closer. His voice was low, threatening. "This school is for people who actually matter." Lucas simply stared at him. Brian smirked. "What? Nothing to say." Lucas turned and walked past them without a word. Behind him, Brian laughed. "Yeah, that's what I thought." But something in Brian's laughter had changed. It wasn't just confidence anymore. There was something else there. Frustration. Lucas knew what was happening. Brian wanted to push him further, wanted him to break, but Lucas wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. Not yet. Brian and his friends thought they had everything under control. To them, Lucas was just another weakling, another easy target who would eventually break under the constant pressure. They didn't realize that he wasn't afraid. He wasn't backing down. He was waiting. He had seen this pattern before. The moment bullies started believing their own dominance, they let their guard down. That's when the real lesson began. The next day started like any other. Brian, Max, and Leo strutted through the halls, acting like they owned the place. Lucas was a routine for them now, a guaranteed source of amusement. They had already planned the next stage. It was time to push him harder. By lunchtime, they had come up with an idea. If Lucas wouldn't react, they'd humiliate him in front of everyone. As Lucas walked through the cafeteria with his tray, Brian moved behind him and shoved him hard. The force was just enough to send the tray flying, food scattering across the floor. For a moment, everything went silent. Then laughter erupted. Brian grinned, Max and Leo laughing along with the rest of the crowd. Lucas stood still, taking in the scene. Oh no, little new guy dropped his lunch. How sad, Brian mocked, stepping closer. What, you gonna cry? Run home to mommy? Lucas looked up at Brian for the first time. His face was unreadable. There was no fear, no anger, just something Brian couldn't quite place. It made him hesitate for half a second, but the crowd was watching, and Brian wasn't about to lose face. Lucas knelt down, calmly picking up his tray. The laughter continued, people whispering and recording on their phones. Brian smirked, satisfied. That should have been the end of it, but something about Lucas's reaction unsettled him. There was no embarrassment, no frustration. Instead, he smiled, a small, knowing smile. Brian's smirk faltered just for a second. That night, Brian, Max, and Leo hung out at their usual spot, a small skate park behind the school. They laughed about the cafeteria incident, replaying it in their heads, mocking Lucas's lack of response. Did you see his face? Max laughed. Dude didn't even flinch. Leo grinned. Yeah, probably too scared to do anything. Brian chuckled, but he wasn't as relaxed as usual. Something about Lucas's smile wouldn't leave his mind. It wasn't the smile of someone who had given up. It was the smile of someone who was waiting. He shook the thought away. Lucas was weak. That was all that mattered. The next morning, Brian arrived at school with a plan. Today, they were going to end it. Max had an idea. Lure Lucas behind the gym, away from teachers and cameras, and put him in his place. No more quiet resistance. No more ignoring them. They were going to make sure he knew who was in charge. They found him in the hallway, same as always, moving through the crowd like a ghost. Brian caught his eye and smirked. Lucas said nothing, but he followed when they led him behind the gym. The area was empty. No teachers, no cameras, just them. Brian cracked his knuckles. All right, new kid, time for a lesson. Lucas stood in the center of the open space, hands in his pockets. His posture was relaxed, as if this was all routine. Brian took a step closer. What, nothing to say? You scared? Lucas tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question. Then, for the first time, he spoke. No, he said quietly. I came to warn you. Brian blinked. Warn me? He laughed. That's cute. You think you're tough now? Max and Leo exchanged confused glances. Something felt off. Lucas wasn't acting like a scared victim. He wasn't pleading. He wasn't running. Brian shoved him hard. Lucas barely moved. Then it happened. Before Brian could react, Lucas grabbed his wrist, his grip like iron. A quick motion, a shift in weight, and suddenly Brian was on the ground, his arm twisted behind his back. Pain shot through his shoulder as he gasped in shock. Max froze. Leo took a step back. Brian struggled, but Lucas held him down effortlessly. There was no hesitation in his movements, no wasted energy. "I grew up in a gym," Lucas said, his voice calm. "Father's a professional trainer. I've been fighting adults since I was 8. Brian's eyes widened. Lucas let go and stepped back. Brian scrambled to his feet, his face red with humiliation. You just got lucky," he spat. Lucas didn't respond. He just watched. And for the first time, Brian wasn't sure if he was the predator or the prey. He took a step back, then another. Max and Leo hesitated. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. Lucas stood there, unmoving, calm, in control. Brian clenched his fist, trying to find his confidence. "You think this makes you cool?" he snapped. "You think—" Lucas moved. Too fast. One smooth step, a shift of weight, and Brian was suddenly on his back, the breath knocked from his lungs. Max lunged, but Lucas sidestepped, grabbed his arm, and flipped him effortlessly onto the pavement. Max groaned, dazed. Leo stood frozen. His hands clenched, but his feet refused to move. Lucas locked eyes with him. Leo turned and ran. Max lay groaning on the ground. Brian gasped for breath, his chest burning. Lucas crouched next to Brian, his voice quiet. "I could have done worse," he said, "but I'm not like you." Brian glared up at him, humiliated. "Screw you." Lucas smiled faintly. "You already did that to yourself." He stood and walked away, leaving them on the ground, defeated. And everything had changed. By the time the first bell rang the next morning, the entire school knew what had happened behind the gym. Rumors spread like wildfire, each retelling more exaggerated than the last. Some students whispered that Lucas had knocked Brian unconscious with a single punch. Others claimed that Max had cried and begged for mercy. The truth was simple. Lucas had humiliated them, and everyone knew it. Brian, Max, and Leo entered the school with their heads low. There were no arrogant smirks, no loud conversations, no playful shoving through the hallways. They moved quietly, avoiding eye contact as if hoping that no one would notice them. But people did. Students who used to laugh at their jokes now avoided them. Some whispered as they walked by, and others chuckled under their breath. The power dynamic had shifted. Lucas, on the other hand, entered the school the same way he always did. Silent, unreadable, unbothered. But now, things were different. People looked at him with curiosity, some with admiration, others with quiet respect. He didn't seek attention, but it followed him anyway. At lunch, when he sat at his usual corner table, students hesitated. Normally, no one would have considered sitting with him, but now there was a subtle change. A few students lingered nearby as if contemplating joining him. One of the basketball players, a tall junior named Chris, passed by and nodded at him. Lucas simply nodded back and continued eating. On the other side of the cafeteria, Brian sat with Max and Leo. It wasn't the same as before. Their usual table, once surrounded by students eager to laugh at their jokes, now felt empty. The students who had once followed them had scattered, either too ashamed or too afraid to be associated with them. Brian's face was tense, his jaw clenched. "This is stupid," Max muttered under his breath, rubbing his wrist where Lucas had thrown him. "People are acting like he's some kind of hero." Leo barely touched his food. He had been quiet all day. "We messed up," he finally said. "We picked the wrong guy." Brian shot him a sharp glare, but Leo just looked away. He wasn't in the mood for another fight. Across the cafeteria, Lucas finished his lunch. He could feel the weight of Brian's stare from across the room, but he didn't acknowledge it. There was nothing left to say. Brian wasn't a threat anymore. By the end of the day, the whispers had only grown louder. Teachers had caught wind of what had happened behind the gym, but no one came forward to report it. Brian and his crew weren't going to tell anyone. They had too much pride for that. Lucas wasn't going to either. He had no interest in revenge or causing more trouble. As he walked down the hallway toward the exit, a few students nodded at him in quiet acknowledgement. Some murmured his name, their voices filled with something close to admiration. But Lucas didn't care about any of that. He wasn't looking for status. He wasn't looking for friends. He had only wanted peace. Behind him, Brian, Max, and Leo lingered by their lockers, watching as Lucas disappeared through the school doors. Brian exhaled sharply. "We're not done," he muttered. Leo shook his head. "Yeah, we are." Max didn't say anything. He just stared after Lucas, deep in thought. Lucas entered the cafeteria as he always did, moving through the noise and chatter without drawing attention to himself. But today was different. Conversations lowered to murmurs as students turned their heads, eyes following him as he walked past. No one laughed at him. No one shoved him. No one tried to block his path. Instead, there was a strange shift in the air, a new kind of energy surrounding him. He wasn't feared. He was respected. He had never asked for it, never sought it, but now it was his whether he wanted it or not. As he moved toward his usual table in the far corner, he noticed something strange. The students who normally ignored him, who normally wouldn't have given him a second glance, hesitated near his table. Some looked as if they were considering sitting down, others just watched, uncertain. One of the basketball players, Chris, gave him a nod again, this time lingering a little longer before moving on. A couple of girls who had never once acknowledged his existence whispered among themselves, glancing in his direction. Lucas sat down, unbothered by the attention, and started eating. Across the room, at their usual table, Brian, Max, and Leo sat in silence. The once lively trio, the self-proclaimed kings of the school, had lost the very thing that made them untouchable: their influence. Their table was quieter now, emptier. The students who had once laughed with them, who had played along with their jokes, now looked at them differently. Some pitied them. Others simply didn't care anymore. They were no longer the center of attention. They had been dethroned. Brian sat rigidly, his face tense, his hands clenched into fists. The humiliation burned inside him, deeper than any bruise Lucas had left. He had lost. He wasn't used to losing, and worst of all, he had lost in front of everyone. He could feel the eyes on him, the whispers that weren't even trying to be discreet. He glanced at Lucas, sitting alone as if nothing had happened, as if he wasn't even thinking about him. That was what made it worse. Lucas had taken everything from him without even trying. Max muttered something under his breath, poking at his food. People are still talking. Leo sighed, running a hand through his hair. They're always going to talk. Doesn't matter now. Brian clenched his jaw. We should have never let it get to this. Leo gave a dry chuckle. Yeah? And whose fault is that? Brian shot him a glare, but there was no fire behind it. He had nothing left to fight with. Across the cafeteria, Lucas continued eating, as if he wasn't aware of the weight of the moment, as if this was just another day. But it wasn't. The cafeteria doors opened, and the usual lunchtime noise continued. But then the unexpected happened. Footsteps approached his table. The conversation around the room began to quiet, not completely silent, but hushed enough for students to notice. Lucas looked up, meeting the eyes of the last person he expected. Brian stood there, stiff, tense, his hands shoved into his pockets. His face was unreadable, but the way he held himself was different. The arrogance, the certainty, the invulnerability, none of it was there anymore. There was hesitation, discomfort, something Lucas had never seen from him before. For a long moment, Brian didn't speak. He just stared, as if forcing himself to be there, forcing himself to do something that felt unnatural. Then, through gritted teeth, barely above a mutter, he said 2 words. "We're done." Lucas didn't react. He didn't move, didn't shift in his seat, didn't so much as blink. He just watched. The silence stretched between them, heavy, expectant. Brian's jaw was tight, his entire body rigid, as if just standing there was painful. Then, after a second that felt longer than it was, Brian turned and walked away. No threats, no insults, no promises of revenge. Just a quiet, bitter acknowledgement of defeat. Leo and Max had been watching from their table. They didn't move as Brian returned and sat down. Leo let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. Max shifted uncomfortably. Lucas took another bite of his food. It was over. Not because he had humiliated Brian, not because he had beaten them physically, but because Brian had finally accepted the truth. He had lost the fight before it even started. Balance had shifted, and Lucas hadn't needed to throw another punch. Lucas never wanted power, never wanted revenge. He just wanted to be left alone. But in the end, he taught them a lesson they would never forget. Respect isn't given. It's earned. What do you think of this story? Have you ever faced something similar? Share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another powerful story.